Good evening, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to the Courtaulds Research Forum program. In this case, a particularly important event as far as those of us working in the general areas of the Caucasus, Iran, the Middle East, broadly speaking, are concerned, where conflict zones are amongst the most prominent features of our work as researcher, as art historians, architectural historians, and indeed, as tonight's speakers will indicate, people whose life work has been dedicated to preservation of heritage sites and finding solutions to issues of conflict zones and post-conflict zones. Tonight's event, Post-Conflict Art History and Cultural Heritage in Dialogue, takes at its heart the notion of an ethical obligation that art history has towards the subjects around which we revolve with our research. And focus is indeed on the cultural heritage in post-conflict zones, with a special attention paid to the zone, which is one very much alive in our minds at the moment, Nagorno-Karabagh in the Caucasus. One of the features of such discussions is that they often happen after an outburst, after an explosive episode, where we all come together and discuss solutions and analyze what has happened and so forth. And this perhaps is an opportunity for us tonight to have a conversation about thinking ahead of time. And as the webinar's description indicates, to use these conflict zones as laboratories in finding solutions for the future, in fact. And we have a panel of experts whose work has been particularly focused in the Caucasus, and they come from different angles with specialisms that are quite diverse, but that they converge, as it were, in this event and in London. And coming from as far away as Yerevan in Armenia, Davis, California, to Boston and Copenhagen. And I'd like to start actually by first thanking them for agreeing to join us, and to say how we proceed. I will introduce each speaker separately in advance of their presentation in order to buy us a moment in between two speakers so that we can change screens and so forth. And at the end of the three presentations, I will invite Talene Geragor to start the panel discussion, posing some of the key questions that she might have with regards to the subject. I would also like to just briefly point out to the fact that we will have a Q&A at the end open to the audience. We are delighted that you have joined us, and encourage you to post your questions once the chat opens for the questions from the audience, and we will engage with those questions and the speakers at that moment. So finally, let me start by introducing myself. I'm Susanne Babae. I teach at the Courtauld Institute and on subjects of the arts of Iran, of the Islamic world, and I'm particularly keen on the material that is covered tonight in part because my interest lies in the links between, especially in the early modern period, between Iran and the Caucasus, just as much as Iran and Central Asia. In other words, thinking about a cultural zone rather than countries and particular linguistic and ethnic communities. Nevertheless, this one is focused on a particularity of an area and a period. Please allow me to introduce our first speaker, Professor Christina Maranchi, and I'm going to be brief in introductions. Professor Maranchi teaches at Tufts University in Armenian Studies, Art and Architecture History, and is chair of the department as well. And she's joining us to speak about a topic entitled, "Where is Artsakh in the History of Medieval Art?" Christina.
So I'm going to present to you a short presentation on a question which I've posed in the title, "Where is Artsakh in the History of Medieval Art?" And I use the term Artsakh, it's the Armenian name for Nagorno-Karabagh, just to avoid confusion here. So let's move forward. I want to start with a comparison, if you will, of two posters, one from 2018 and the other from 2021. In 2018, there was a blockbuster exhibition on Armenian art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the culmination of decades-long scholarship in the field, and an exhibition which sought, and I think successfully achieved, to show Armenia's connectedness to the cultures around it, specifically in the Middle Ages, but also into the early modern period, connecting it to Byzantium, to East Asia, to the Islamic world, and to Western Europe. And this show was a kind of high point for medieval Armenian culture's exposure in the United States and across the world. And it was not only an important show, but it was an important moment for the Armenian community as well, to feel proud that their culture was being celebrated on the august facades of a McKim mead and white building, such as the Met. In 2021, and that is just a few months ago, a series of posters appeared in the London Underground, a campaign of publicity promoting Azerbaijan as a center of multiculturalism. And this poster you see features a monastery called Dadivank, which is an Armenian monastery dated largely from the 13th to 14th centuries in its architectural fabric and covered in hundreds of Armenian inscriptions. And the appropriation of this monument in this publicity campaign was a move that caused extreme distress to the Armenian community, and the campaign and its posters have since been taken down. In a way, I use this comparison to frame a real shift in the status of the study of medieval Armenia in the past 3 years. And I am very concerned about the way the war and its aftermath will affect the study of medieval Artsakh. So let's just move forward. What are we talking about? So on this map, you see in green, the Republic of Armenia, and you see in the striped area, the Republic of Artsakh, and around it, the dotted lines indicate areas taken over by Azerbaijan, reflecting the terms of the deal made between Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan in November 9th. And along with that handover of territory meant the handover of a great number, in the thousands, of Armenian churches, monasteries, tombstones, sites, bridges, castles, houses, and so on. But in addition to this handover and what this means in terms of access to these sites by scientists and scholars, and the regions that you were looking at are largely inaccessible to scholars, we have other questions to address. And that is how we go about studying medieval Artsakh and its rich monumental, epigraphic, sculptural, pictorial traditions, given the war and its aftermath. And we face a series of entangled problems regarding race and nationalism, the scholarship on art history, conquest and colonization, heritage and heritage destruction, and even the canon, the very sort of those monuments that are considered central to the study of art. All of what's happened makes me think about this man, Joseph Strygovsky, who was a professor in Vienna of Christian art, but of many different traditions of art, a very prolific scholar and a very problematic scholar. Strygovsky wrote the foundational work on Armenian architecture, something like 840-page work that was the first to introduce in a systematic and comprehensive way the corpus of Armenian architecture, inscriptions, sculpture to a Western-speaking audience. And I wrote about this work now 20 years exactly ago, and how it affected the ensuing decades of scholarship on Armenian art. Strygovsky's work was comprehensive. It drew from a kind of high point of scholarship in Armenological circles. And this work dates to 1918, but it actually was produced over the course of the First World War and during the Armenian Genocide. But it is a tremendously comprehensive work, as I said, drawing from Armenological experts, and remains in some ways still fundamental to the study of the field. But it's a problematic work because of the way it frames Armenian architecture and the claims it makes about Armenian architecture. So Strygovsky was convinced that Armenian architecture was an Aryan form, and that it was a type of architecture that then traveled to inform Byzantine architecture and Western European architecture. And I'm showing you here on this slide a grand plan of the 7th century church of Bagaran, now destroyed. And then we can see some of what he sees as its diffusion from Athens to Milan to Germany-des-Prés. Even in the title of this section, Der Sieg der armenischen Kuppelbauform in Europa, you can see the kind of rhetoric that Strygovsky is presenting. This isn't simply a history. For Strygovsky, medieval Armenian architecture is a war. So it's a war between essentially two competing cultural/racial forces. On the one hand, what he calls the Machtmenschen, the power men of the Mediterranean, for whom the basilica was the driving architectural form and their way of subduing the other sort of cultural racial category, which was the Aryans. And Aryans, for Strygovsky, built domed centralized churches like the one I drew for you on the right. So for Strygovsky, these two building forms really encapsulated two competing antagonistic forces. And this is made very explicit in his work, that he sees these two forces as antagonistic to each other. And if we want to make a graphic novel out of it, we might make something like this. So this is a kind of background to the history of medieval Armenian architecture. And ultimately, Strygovsky puts Armenian architecture into this category that he calls the North, which is largely a kind of a made-up category. It doesn't necessarily have to do with sort of where his cultures are in the globe. But the point is that it's this highly racialized theory, an art history that is steeped in racial ideology, that informs the most basic foundational work on Armenian architecture. And this was the problem that scholars faced in the aftermath of Strygovsky. And so if you tried to read a work on Armenian architecture of a general nature from the mid-20th century, what you would do is read a lot about Josef Strygovsky. So I was shocked as a grad student to read in this, this survey by Richard Krautheimer, Early Christian and Byzantine Architecture from the latter half of the 20th century, that I was reading actually about a kind of a debunking of claims that Strygovsky had made. And that's when I realized how powerful this person was and what a long shadow he had cast in the field. Fast forward many decades, and now what we talk about more than anything in art history, it seems, is a global art history, is a connected art history. And I'm just giving you some examples of these kinds of efforts in textbooks, in courses, in websites. And Susan, I'll take this opportunity to remember fondly with you the Courtauld Crossing Frontiers initiative of a few years back, in which a group of students and scholars went together to Armenia, to Georgia, to Turkey, to Jerusalem, to look at connections across cultures, architectural cultures, and looking at sculpture as well. So there's been a tremendous change in the way we study Armenian art and architecture, and the Met show really was a kind of culmination of that. Now, what do we do with Artsakh? How do we locate Artsakh in a global Middle Ages? And this is where I want to subject you to a series of questions, because I think when we try to do this work, we have to ask specific questions about specific sites. I almost think about this as a kind of comprehensive exam. If I were to give one to students, or maybe a series of dissertation topics like this one, discuss the monastery of Amaras, which is an early monastery in Artsakh, early Christian monastery in Artsakh, later rebuildings, but discuss it in the context of the role of Jerusalem in the planning and layout of the tomb of St. Grigor. So I'm just throwing this out at you. You don't have to answer it or write any essays. But the interesting thing here is that excavations have shown that the tomb actually opens to the east, that is outside the church to the east, which is highly unusual in the context of early Christian architecture, but which the archaeologist who's worked on this site thinks is connected to Jerusalem. So it might be very interesting for someone to study further this if they were able to get access to the site. And we'll hear maybe more about that from Hegnar in a little while. We might also ask a question like this: discuss connections of the Dadivank frescoes in relation to painting traditions of Georgia and Byzantium. Dadivank is a 13th and 14th century monastery, now under the control of the Russian peacekeepers. Will it be possible for us to go and to look at this site and to examine its frescoes and ask these questions, or look also at neighboring churches in the region and think about their fresco programs? Discuss the representation of breastfeeding across the medieval world, including the Khachkar at Handabert. So Handabert is among those places taken over by Azerbaijan. And this Khachkar, beautiful Armenian carved crossstone, shows us a very unusual image of a mother breastfeeding a child with really interesting connections to the Virgo lactans, the breastfeeding virgin. Let's move into the modern. Let's discuss 19th century Armenian architecture, patronage, and identity, and the modern reception of medieval architectural traditions. Here we might want to go to Shushi, which is now under Azeri control, and look at the churches of the Kazanchetsot's Cathedral and Khanat-Jam, or the church dedicated to John the Baptist. And as you can see, both of them are severely damaged, and in the case of Kazanchetsot's, already modified so that it no longer has its pointed cupola. Discuss portal decoration, the relationship between inscriptions and decoration, the diversification in the use of muqarnas and the use of muqarnas in medieval and the early modern period. So here we would want to look particularly not just at 13th and 14th century Armenian architecture, which is famous for its muqarnas, but also at the 17th century. And we'd want to look at the way inscriptions work with that muqarnas decoration. Again, this is a real worry because we know of the threats to efface more Armenian inscriptions. And so there's a concern about the extent to which this work can be done. Finally, discuss the Isle Tetraconch across Georgia, Armenia, and Caucasian Albania, considering questions of liturgy, history, and theology. So if we wanted to connect this wonderfully complicated building form that is typical of the Caucasus from Georgia to Caucasian Albania, can we do that now? Can we go and look at the site and do that work? So and then lastly, discuss Artsakh within the context of the Caucasus, Byzantium, and the Islamic world. This is the big picture question. It's a question that would help us to integrate this incredibly rich zone into the study of a global Middle Ages. But all of this is now in danger and threatened. So that I'm just going to finish up the casualties of the war. It's not just people or monuments. It's any sense of the complexity of the medieval world and any sense of the connectedness of the medieval world, and quite simply curiosity. And in its place, what we get is an essentializing narrative about medieval monuments driven by origins, theories, and conquest. We get fake multiculturalism for profit, raised landscapes, monuments return to an invented original appearance, and foregone conclusions. And with this, actually, I'm just going to stop there. This feels to me a bit like a Strogovsky moment. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to
Thank you.
my
Thank
host.
you very much. Christina, I also thank you for reminding me of the wonderful learning we shared traveling around the Caucasus together. And I'd like to save those provocative questions you posed and a discussion on that really powerful list of things besides lost people and lost monuments for us to discuss at the end, if I may, and move on to invite Hernar Zeitlian Wattenpaw to present us with a discussion that she has recorded, because Hernar is now in Yerevan and she was not particularly sure if the Wi-Fi was powerful enough for her to present without any interruptions. But she is here live and she will be joining us as we go into discussion afterwards. Hernar is a professor of art history at the University of California in Davis and the recipient of multiple prizes. And indeed, as all of the speakers are, in fact, also very much someone recognized for her public intellectual role as well. please, I refer everyone to look at the biographies of our speakers. They are an incredible group, in fact. And Hernar's talk is entitled Art History, Cultural Heritage, and Human Rights.
Greetings. Thank you very much, Professor Susan Babae, for organizing this panel. Thank you for the opportunity to participate through these recorded remarks. And let me apologize in advance if I am not able to join the panel live due to my travel schedule. I'm now going to share my screen. Art history and cultural heritage are both concerned with studying materials from the past and exhibiting them in the present. Broadly speaking, art history is the study of the theory and the development of visual culture. Cultural heritage is the practice of caring for objects and practices from the past and preserving them for the future. The work of art history and cultural heritage are entwined, and they also intersect with institutions like museums and practices like excavation, exhibition, historic preservation, and urban planning. Despite all of these connections, however, it is relatively uncommon for art historians to study cultural heritage or to work collaboratively with cultural heritage professionals. Yet this is what the distinguished scholars on this panel have done, some for many years, and I am delighted to be with you. Art history, cultural heritage, along with allied professional fields, played a role in the rise of the ideal of world heritage, which gained momentum after the assaults on cultural heritage that were part and parcel of the horrors of the Second World War. The idea of world heritage, significant works of culture are conceived as belonging to all of humanity. While specific types of heritage may have particular resonance for and connections to particular human groups, all of humanity has a link to such objects which represent, quote, the cultural heritage of all humankind. The idea of universal heritage is espoused by such international organizations as UNESCO. The idea is positive, celebratory, politically neutral, and beneficial. It aims at preserving the best of the culture of humankind for future generations. Special international protections have been created to safeguard cultural heritage in times of armed conflict, such as the 1954 Hague Convention. In 2003, the international community reaffirmed its commitment in the UNESCO Declaration on the Intentional Destruction of Cultural Heritage. And yet these standards and norms are not always upheld, and states have not always fulfilled their obligations. In recent years, UNESCO and World Heritage itself have been criticized for many inequities and failures, including the failure to prevent or deter the destruction of heritage, especially during conflict, and the failure to impose consequences to the mistreatment of cultural heritage with any degree of consistency. Activists and legal experts have called for a human rights-based approach to cultural heritage and even to the study of art history. They argue that cultural heritage is also a human rights issue, which is best tackled through a human rights approach. Traditionally, cultural rights have been seen as less important than such fundamental human rights as the right to life, to equality, to health. This prompted the UN Human Rights Council to reiterate that, quote, cultural rights are an integral part of human rights, which are universal, indivisible, interrelated, and interdependent, unquote. In recent years, however, cultural rights have gained in legitimacy in many different arenas. The effort continues to demonstrate that cultural rights are key to the overall implementation of universal human rights. Cultural heritage is deeply linked to other human rights, such as the right to freedom of expression, freedom of conscience and religion, as well as the economic rights of people who work in the industries related to cultural heritage. The intentional destruction of cultural heritage then can be described as an assault on cultural rights, but also on a range of other human rights. Acts of deliberate destruction are often accompanied by other assaults on human dignity and human rights. As such, they have to be addressed in the context of more global, more holistic strategies for the promotion of human rights and for peace building. The destruction of heritage as part of conflict is unfortunately a global phenomenon. The duty to safeguard cultural heritage, especially threats to UNESCO World Heritage Sites, falls primarily upon the state that is home to such heritage. However, during civil conflict or war, states might be unable or unwilling to safeguard heritage, and sometimes states might even be party to the destruction of heritage. In Syria, we have seen cultural heritage as a collateral damage of war, but also targeted as a strategy of war to inflict damage to the opponent's religious beliefs and to cultural treasures, as in the case of Palmyra. We are concerned today with the case of Nagorno-Karabagh. It shows very poignantly that the destruction of cultural heritage is part and parcel of conflict, not an unfortunate side effect, and that the destruction of culture is part of a repertoire of violent acts and of assaults on human dignity. The recent war in the region was extremely violent. It began in September 27, 2020, and concluded in early November with a tripartite agreement between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia, and the arrival of Russian peacekeepers. It cost the lives of over 7,000 individuals and displaced thousands. However, the situation remains tense and evidence of atrocities continues to emerge. I will give a few examples of how the destruction of cultural heritage in this particular recent conflict reflects some of the broader issues in cultural heritage and human rights. This is the Cathedral of the Holy Saviour, known as Khazanchetsotz, in the city of Shushi or Shusha. It was built between 1868 and 1887, possibly on the site of a pre-existing church. It is one of the largest cathedrals of the Armenian Church in the world. It holds a number of sacred relics, and it is a pilgrimage destination for Armenians globally. During the war on October 8, 2020, it was shelled twice in the same day, while civilians were sheltering inside. The cathedral became a symbol of the intentional destruction of culture, and it prompted an international outcry and concern for Armenian religious heritage. Since the ceasefire, the cathedral has come under Azerbaijani control. Azerbaijan's president, Ilham Aliyev, declared Shusha his country's cultural capital in January 2021 and announced that the city will be the focus of a major rebuilding campaign. Reports indicate that construction companies have already obtained government contracts to build roads and to construct buildings, and apparently there have been demolitions. This indicates that major rebuilding activities are taking place before any assessment or monitoring or input from by a range of stakeholders or by international organizations. In early May, reports emerged that the Azerbaijani government had dismantled the famous tall umbrella dome of the cathedral. That's the image you're seeing on the right. This is ongoing without any consultation or input from key stakeholders like the Armenian Church or the Armenian residents who have been displaced. Many believe that this is a destruction in disguise, and one that is done in a top-down, exclusive, and opaque manner. There is no information about the relics and religious objects in the church. In addition, Armenian church officials and worshippers are not allowed to visit or to conduct religious activities. The example of Dadivang, so Shusha was here and Dadivang is here. The example of Dadivang also raises the issue of the right to access cultural and religious sites. Recall that a key cultural right is expressed in Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to participate in cultural life without any discrimination. Dadivang is a monastic complex of the Armenian Church that dates from the 9th to the 13th centuries. A center of early Christianity, Dadivang features frescoes and sculptures, medieval Armenian inscriptions, as well as relics. As a result of the ceasefire agreement of November 2020, Dadivang came under Azerbaijani military control. Following an international campaign over concerns about Azerbaijan's record of destroying Armenian religious sites, by agreement, Dadivang is protected by Russian peacekeepers, for now. The Armenian priests remained at the monastery where they continue liturgical services, even if they are surrounded now by military installations. More worrisome is the fact that the Armenian residents of the nearby village have all been displaced. In effect, Dadivang has been severed from its community. By agreement, worshippers and pilgrims are supposed to have access to the site, however, at the discretion of military authorities. And there are reports that access is not always possible, making it difficult to access sites of worship without discrimination. There is an increasing consensus that the protection of cultural heritage should be part of peace building, and that peacekeepers should receive training in how to deal with cultural heritage. One hopes that these ideas can be implemented here. The international community is also concerned about the rhetoric of Azerbaijani officials that erases Armenians from their own cultural heritage. Here, the Minister of Culture of Azerbaijan alleges that Dadivang is not Armenian at all. These assertions have very little connection to historical facts. Nevertheless, they are repeated and seem to form the basis of very real state policies that have the effect of depriving a community of its cultural rights, property rights, and religious rights. So we see here the interconnection of the various kinds of rights. The past treatment of Armenian religious monuments by Azerbaijan heightens fears for the future. Between 1997 and 2006, the Azerbaijani government waged a devastating campaign against Armenian heritage in Nakhichevan, an Azerbaijani enclave. They destroyed around 89 churches, as well as the largest medieval Armenian cemetery in the world, located in Julfa near the Iranian border, and containing thousands of khachkars, or carved memorial stones. UNESCO was not allowed to investigate, and in effect, Azerbaijan still enjoys impunity for what has been called the worst cultural genocide of the 21st century. This indicates the power of a state actor over cultural heritage on its own territory, and states' ability to limit the work of international organizations, even for simple fact-finding missions. In a situation where cultural heritage is so politicized, there are often types of cultural heritage that no one seems interested in, that do not fit into anyone's narrative, and that fall through the cracks. This is the case of the Soviet-era architecture. Before the war, Nagorno-Karabagh had become a favorite destination for tourists who traveled the former Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, and satellite countries in search of examples of Soviet modernist architecture. I'm showing you a World War II memorial monument outside Shushi. It features relief figures of soldiers from different divisions of the Soviet military. Nearby, a pillar bears the red Soviet star. A group of children and women here complete the ensemble. The Soviet period has not left many good memories in the region, so monuments from this era tend to be unloved by contemporary communities. I have advocated for monuments such as this, not only because modern architecture is important in and of itself, but also because one can argue that the Soviet period is part of the common past of all the communities in this region and could perhaps provide a common ground. Unfortunately, so far, I have not been able to find information about whether this monument still stands. There was a series of statements by international cultural institutions calling for the protection of cultural heritage in Karabakh. You see on the screen the statement by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And here's the statement by UNESCO. In Karabakh, we are seeing again the power of states as compared to the limited range of options for minority or indigenous communities. When a state is unable or unwilling to protect heritage on its own territory, the international community is hobbled in what they can do. UNESCO announced several months ago their determination to send a monitoring team to Karabakh. However, Azerbaijan has not allowed UNESCO to visit. What then should the international community do when a state home to endangered cultural heritage is intransigent, or worse yet, maybe itself threatening cultural property? It is critical to take a historically rooted multidisciplinary approach. The rigorous practice of history and art history are fundamental in order to have a factual basis for discussion. We must also take into account the voices and concerns of local communities, and if needed, displaced communities that still consider these places centers of worship. These are the voices that are most often ignored or marginalized. In the best models, cultural heritage has been mobilized as a medium for dialogue and eventually peace building, as in the case of the Bicommunal Technical Committee on Cultural Heritage in Cyprus. Yet such initiatives are very difficult and very fraught. Too often, cultural heritage is politicized and it is instrumentalized to punish and humiliate one's opponents. This is hardly a path to end conflict and to promote lasting peace. In general, groups advocate for the protection of the cultural heritage that they care about, that they have an affiliation with. From a human rights perspective, one has to take a broader universal approach. We need to look at the entire range of threats to heritage and to everyone's heritage. It is critical to mainstream a human rights approach, and that requires a universal and inclusive approach to cultural heritage. It would go a long way to show that the international community stands by its own professed principles of defending cultural heritage, local communities, and cultural rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elnar. And I hope everyone took note of a little flashing of the image of the missing pages in which your book, which deals with the sorts of assaults on cultural heritage that you have studied in terms of manuscripts, actually. Thank you very much for this thought-provoking talk. And I think what I'm going to do is immediately move on to invite our next speaker, Dr. Carsten Paladan Müller, who is an archaeologist and very much one of those cultural heritage workers, if I may put you in under the title of worker, activist, and involved in variety of contexts of work with cultural heritage, research, and so forth, and acting at the highest levels to facilitate protection of monuments, but also facilitate dialogue and work towards preservation of cultural heritage. His talk is entitled Cultural Heritage, an Instrument of Conflict and Reconciliation. Please continue.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Susan, for having me here. I've really been looking forward to this. I'm going to talk about the past, the actual past, and how we deal with it. Well, in fact, none of us really know what it was like because we didn't live then. So what we are left with will be the outcome of a complicated process of forgetting and remembering. If we remembered everything, well, then we would be completely overwhelmed. Everything would be a chaos for us. So we have to forget something in order to have something structured in our memories. So we are left with something we could call the icons of the past, what is actually remembered. But right now, I think we'll just forget about the remembering and proceed to the Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal, Muslim imperial continuum, also sometimes called the Gunpowder Empires. They existed on the basis of other older imperial formations until the 19th century, which was also the most predatory part of the European colonial expansion. At its height, these formations reached from Budapest in Central Europe and to the Bay of Bengal. There have been many ideas about what these empires were like to live in. They were multicultural, and today some people prefer to think of them as paradise of multicultural cohabitation, whereas others have seen them as Woodrow Wilson after the First World War, when he labeled them the prison of nations. Of course, they were neither nor, they were both and. They were sometimes well-functioning cohabitation of very diverse communities, and at other times they were bloody places of oppression of certain minorities, and that shifted with the political contours within the empires and around the empires. It might be useful to compare empire states with nation states. Empire states are, as said, multicultural cohabitation of groups with different religions, languages, and ways of telling their histories, whereas nations are typically monocultural, or ideally monocultural cohabitation of subjects and citizens who ideally share religion, language, and the way they tell their history. In the empire state, the loyalty of the subjects goes to the ruler. In the nation state, the loyalty of the citizens goes towards the nation. Within the empire states, a large degree of autonomy may be given to minority communities to regulate intercommunal affairs. Within the nation state, all citizens adhere to the same national community and are subjected to the same legal regulations. In the empire states, the ruler controls intercommunal relations in a hub and spoke model. Clear-cut distinctions between the communities are crucial to the divide and rule basis of imperial political power. In the nation state, with citizenship as primary and shared identity for all members, the communities relate freely and directly with each other. I know this is a grossly simplified way of portraying things, but that's the way I can do it here. And I can simplify even further with this graphic, where you have the empire state at the left, where you see the different communities all relating indirectly to each other, controlled through the hub, which is the imperial center. Whereas in the nation state, the diversity is not the same. All can see themselves, recognize themselves in other parts of the same community, and they relate among each other without being centrally mediated. Now, when this broke down, these imperial formations, that happened in a geopolitical context of intense competition between European powers. It happened at the 19th and 20th centuries, and what had happened in Europe was a three interconnected revolutions, we could say. The Industrial Revolution, the rise of the nation state, and a dramatic military transformation facilitated by the two former. That led to an expansion of European economic power, where Europe and Europe's banks controlled global financing, global markets for industrial products, global markets for raw materials. Also, the European dominated the expanding transportation and communication networks built with new technology, steamships, railroads, telegraphs, and so on. What we also saw was a secondary colonization of the Gunpowder Empires. We saw territorial expansion of Western Europe, colonization of Africa and Asia, Russian imperial expansion towards the east, Central Asia, and into the south, into the Caucasus, where they took over, conquered parts of the Ottoman and parts of the Persian empires. In the late Ottoman Empire, that led to a systemic stress and a gradual collapse. There was a humiliating series of military defeats with breakaway nation-state formations like Greece, like Serbia, like Bulgaria, and so on. And they were conquered by competing European powers, Russia's conquest in the Caucasus, and Italian, British, and French conquest in Africa and in the Middle East. There was also a second-tier economic colonization of the Ottoman Empire by Europe, with the debts to foreign finance, who imposed strict economic regulations on the Ottomans. There was export from the Ottoman Empire of raw materials and import of industrial products, and there was an extensive dependence on foreign expertise for modernization. Together with the losses of territory, a major influx of Muslim refugees from the Balkans and the Caucasus came into what is today's Anatolia and Turkish Republic. It led to land shortages, led to famines, economic crisis. The worst was probably an increased alignment of ethnic and socioeconomic divisions within the Ottoman Empire. The non-Muslim minorities were averagely better educated, and accordingly, they also held more positions requiring higher educations, and also a disproportionate share of the control over both foreign and local trade and financing. The worst was probably that European powers and Christian minorities were seen by the Ottoman rulers as colluding. Now, we all know how that ended in a brutal series of pogroms, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. The 1915 genocide of the Armenian population was only the final in a series of genocides that had taken place against the Armenians. We also know about the Greeks fleeing their thousands of years old settlements at the Black Sea coast and the Mediterranean coast. We also know the changing demography of former Ottoman cities like Salonika, today's Greek Thessaloniki, where there used to be a huge Jewish community, a huge Turkish community, and a huge Greek community. After 1922, and especially after the Second World War, it was only a Greek town. Now, let's go back for a while to this thing about the past, what we remember and what we forget. It's not just so that we remember everything as we know, but it's also so that it's not up to us necessarily individually to decide what we remember and what we forget. There's a societal impact. There's an editing. Pierre Nora, the French historian, in his writings about lieux de mémoire, or memory spaces or places, has taught us about how we select certain bits and pieces from the past, being being material or immaterial, to remind us of what the past was, or to serve us as icons of the past. And Hannah Arendt, the German American Jewish philosopher, has told us about what an important instrument for the power, the political power, the past is. Rewriting, editing the past is essential to how you actually consolidate your own political power by referring back to its natural growth out of the past. Now, let's try to look at a landscape where we have two different types of cultures living amongst each other. One population are those who build red triangular monuments, the others build yellow circular monuments. Let's see if we can carve out some nation states of them. Here we have two areas, and then we have to begin to edit the past in order to, let's say, let it fit the way we want to see today as grown naturally out of the past. So we get rid of what doesn't fit. Now we have triangles on one side and circles on the other side of the border. But there are two abnormities here. There's a yellow triangle among the red triangles and the red circle among the yellow ones. So we get rid of them too. So in that way, we have two clear-cut different populations living on each side of the border with different histories. Now, this is not just something we imagine. This is something which has happened over and over again. With the division of the Raj, British India, into Pakistan and India, that has happened several times. In 1992, a Hindu mob destroyed the Babae Masjid, a mosque in Ayodhya, India, famous mosque, one of the earliest, built under Babur, the first Mughal emperor of India. That was immediately responded in Pakistan by Muslim mobs who attacked and destroyed about 30 Hindu temples there. So here you go. Of course, that has happened again, or before that, in Turkey, after the genocide, where about up to 1.5 million Armenians were killed. There was a systematic cleansing also of the landscape, because the landscape was, of course, meant to fit the new narrative about the Turkish history of these landscapes. So a lot of churches, monasteries, and other buildings left by the Armenian communities were simply destroyed. The picture here is the Küçükönk monastery in the Kars region of Turkey, near the Armenian border. At the beginning of the century, of the 20th century, there were 5 churches in this monastery. Today, 100 years later, there's only one Subsagis left there on the plateau. Even place names were altered. Place names that reminded of an Armenian presence were altered. So that was very systematic. New local histories were written in Turkey to rewrite the history, to introduce new narratives. Much of today's heritage destruction takes place exactly where thousands of years of multicultural imperial formations within a century were succeeded by what is now often fragile nation states. And in the nation building projects, there's often been dramatic ethnic cleansing and homogenization of what used to be a very diverse cultural fabric. In that process, heritage has often been destroyed or manipulated to fit into a new narrative that could legitimize the nation state as the natural outcome of a long history. Sharing heritage across cultures seems to be the best way for us to prevent its destruction. Thank you for your attention. And oh, just one more thing, some bonus material. In 2020, Dua Lipa, a British singer of Kosovo Albanian descent, aroused severe serpent anger after having praised Albanian Ivar. It's a relish, it's a vegetal relish, which is common to much of Balkan, but everybody claims it for themselves. And one might just wonder if we might, instead of making such an effort to be different, could also sometimes celebrate what we have in common. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karsten. This was wonderful. And I love, that was not Marmite, of course. I hope you're not talking about Marmite, but.
No, definitely not.
No, I know. Well, thank you so much for what was really a wonderful sort of an overview of the ills of nation state formations, actually, and from much of which we must think that Europe holds a great deal of responsibility, in fact. So what I'm going to do is invite everyone to please come back on screen, and would like to invite, unless of course, Tallinn, do you have slides to show? Or, okay, so I'd like to invite Tallinn Gergor, Professor of Art History and Architectural History at University of California in Davis, to and also, I have to say, I have read her dissertation, I have examined her dissertation, I have read her book manuscripts, and I am really close to all of you, and I'm very grateful for you to agree to come together and present what I hope is a kind of a multifaceted, multi-dimensional conversation about the subject at hand, which is no less than human rights issue, a hugely important one. But before we go there, I want to ask Tallinn to begin with at least this dialogue.
Thank you, Susanne. Thank you for putting this together. You forgot that we actually have a book together. It's a really privilege to be part of this panel. From the three rich talks, I felt this kind of the failure of our discipline in the way that Christina's talk raised the issue of art historiography and how it has muddied today's research and access and policies of preservation of a body of art historical entities that we're trying to access and study. Helnar's talk did the same thing in the way that how so many institutions and entities outside art history, outside the museum world, outside the art world, are actually in charge of the preservation or destruction of monuments. And I think we felt this very acutely after the end of the war, where we were like, what do we do now? We know a lot about these buildings that we care a lot about, but how do we go about trying to make sure that they're protected? And again, we felt that we saw that there's this powers outside art history and the art world that are actually in charge. And Carsten's paper gave us a global and historical, how global and historical paradigm shifts of the shift from empire to nation, the shift from much more diverse identity units actually define what art history is and what are the art historical narratives and how we go about preserving them. So I want to raise, I have two questions to raise, and with two specific examples. One is this notion of post-ethnic preservation policies. And given that South Caucasus historically was Persianate, and one of the examples that so we have the Gohar Agha Mosque in Shusha was preserved by the Armenian local government with private donations from a Kazakh businessman, but with the expertise of the Iranian Masons and the Ministry of Culture. And so it was completely preserved as a show of, I suppose, the diversity, to show the diversity of Shushi. And now it has been, obviously Shushi was handed over to the Azeris, and the Azeris have a discourse about that preservation as erasing the Azeri identity from the mosque and instead placing an Iranian identity for the mosque. And for art historians, this is quite uncomfortable, because we know that this part of the entire part of the world was actually a Persianate in culture. So that's one of the examples I want to raise, the preservation of the Gohar Agha Mosque, and then also the inclusion of two of the monasteries, the Armenian monasteries in Iranian territories, the monastery of St. Thaddeus and the monastery of St. Stepanos, which became part of the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2008 under the auspices of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So I want to ask the panelists if we can discuss this notion of how we are, as art historian, stuck between these historical constructs of nations and how they're ascribed to historical monuments, as Christina talked about, and these entities that are supposed to preserve, but they're just unable because the nation decides what the fate of its monuments are. And so Helnar's notion of a human right approach to art history and cultural heritage as dialogue, what are we as art historian and as people who from within the art world, how do we navigate this extremely complex network?
Who would like to start? I think, thank you, Tallene. You posed some really important questions. And this is not just about Armenians and Azeris. It's also about those tense national identity formations that, as Carsten said, have to do with what we remember, what we forget, and how we rewrite and re-edit and deal with history. That a project of fixing a mosque itself becomes a contested site for, is this an Azeri identity or an Iranian identity? And these are historically one and the same almost. So would one of you like to start, Hernar or Christina or whoever, Karsten?
Can I just say something here? I think for all the empires that I described, the three empires, were all Persianates. Basically, they shared culture in many ways. Persian was a lingua franca and a culture which spread out, as you will know. I was just wondering, I don't know the specifics about the mosque and its restoration, but from an Azeri point of view, I would guess that they would have thought, why not invite Azeri architects to come and let's say restore or join in the restoration project, and then represent their understanding of the Persianate Azeri mix. I mean, Armenian architects would dearly love to be involved in the Turkish restoration projects of Armenian heritage in Turkey, which has been allowed in a few examples. And I think I know it's complicated in the real political world. It's awfully complicated to do that. But I mean, that could be one reason for the Azeri saying, we don't want that, we reject it. Whether it was actually the same thing they would have done, they don't like it because they were not involved. Would that make sense for you?
I'll jump in too, to say, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I think what Talim pointed out, and also building on Karsten's wonderful presentation, I think what we're seeing in this particular region, and that we see in other regions as well, is the incredibly complex layering of historical periods, influences, ideas that are constantly in flux. People describe the Caucasus as a corridor where people and ideas and empires come and go. And it's also a place where you have these looming shadows of past empires and cultural spheres of influence. And certainly the Iranian presence is very, very deep, going back to the Qajar Empire and even before. We see it in the language, we see it in construction techniques, the use of brick forms, but also all kinds of other material and intangible aspects of heritage, the way people cook rice, for example. But we also have another empire that maybe we do need to mention, which was the 19th century Russian Empire. And which was, of course, had a very contentious relationship with the Iranian Empire. And one of the results or consequences of the war has been, as many have observed, reassertion of the Russian presence in the region in a very real way, a military presence, a very robust military presence, an extension and a reassertion of Russian imperial designs over the region. This is where, again, I think we have to remember the importance of the Soviet period, which was not exactly an empire, but it had many imperial aspects. So we're dealing with a part of the world that is extremely layered, extremely complex, with many different communities, many different artistic practices entwined. And part of the legacy of the art historians, architects, and others that Christina described has been to disentangle these very rich strands of fabric to create what is purely Armenian or purely Azerbaijani or purely Iranian. And I think that is very difficult to do, very fraught, and as we're seeing now, can also lead to very problematic and dangerous places. And I also will say, I'm glad Talim brought up the example of the state of Iran, the Islamic Republic, nominated and successfully placed the Armenian monastic complexes in northern Iran on the World Heritage List. And here is really something that we can point to as a success, as a state recognizing a community in its on its territory. And the nomination for the monastic complexes includes not only the monasteries themselves, which are architecturally very significant, but the nomination also includes the pilgrimage there, which I find very significant. So it includes the practices of the communities that live there, that practice their religion at the site, as well as the architecture. And I think it's important to point to this as a great positive, especially since the Islamic Republic, let's be honest, it does not have a spotless human right record, to put it mildly. So here is an example where they have done something that is very positive, and that one hopes to see in other places as well.
Yeah, it's a really good point, in the sense that in some ways, you would imagine that support of the Armenian monasteries had a political dimension attached to it.
Oh, I'm sure.
As, you know, it's not, in other words, the benefits of showing that kind of tolerance, quote unquote, where elsewhere it is in short supply.
Indeed.
In Iran, it has its political benefits for the state, actually. And there lies, in fact, the choices, what to preserve and what not to preserve as part of that process of what Karsten was talking about, the identity formation. And Iran benefits from having this complexity preserved, as long as it does not oppose its political posture at the moment. And I think, speaking in veiled terms, it should be clear that states are hugely motivated by these kinds of protections and destructions. And Iran presents us with that complexity. The claim that it is indeed historically all over this region, going from Anatolia all the way to Bengal, probably, is part of the implicit claim in a way as well. So what about the fact that art history is written according to conception of the nation state? We talk about Italian art. We shouldn't. We should talk about Italian art after it's formed into a nation state, which is pretty late. Whereas we do not have, you know, a sense of what is Iranian art, really, except that it fits into either pre-Islamic or post-Islamic, in which case then the notion of a nation's claim to those histories becomes really complicated, right? So what is Armenian? Armenians of New Jolfa of Esfahan present us with an alternative to the early modern Armenian art and architecture that is tightly knit with what is Esfahan, more than what is Yerevan, for instance, right?
Yeah, can I jump in, Susan, just to continue what you're saying and what Hegnar did. So I think it's very important also that we say that the job of the medieval historian and medieval art historian, the tools that they use, it's an entirely different world than the kind of nation state issues and instruments. And so what I do is I ask questions, and I try to do it in my presentation. So you ask questions, you try to understand, how is this person or this monument talking about itself? And you have to be ready for surprises. That's what I love about doing the work on the deeper past. And may I just mention a really wonderful article by Rachel Goshgarian that was published in Hyperallergic on medieval identities in Artsakh, which addresses some of these and which tries to do something that towards a more sophisticated conceptualization of the culture of Artsakh than has been produced. So just to say, it's not just about sort of a deep past versus a modern nation state, or complexity versus fairly straightforward understanding of nationalism. There are different tools and different resources and a whole different perspective that a historian has. And it's hard to really kind of bring those together to work on any project, as I've experienced myself. And that gets to the issue of how you define a particular cultural sphere. And, that's always hard. I think, the work that's been done in art history over the past several decades is showing the problem of these rigid, impermeable cultural spheres. At the same time, we all know the problem of having complete breakdown, and how do we even begin to talk about anything? But that's not the problem right now. Our problem is that we're up against what feels to me, again, very old, very much early 20th century, late 19th century formations, almost antagonistic, and let's just say it, antagonistic cultural spheres that are not, sort of, that can't live side by side, let alone be entangled.
Yeah. And I think one of the points here is museums, where that kind of late 19th century, early 20th century remains the guiding light, are in fact part of this dialogue, should be part of this dialogue.
Yeah.
It's part of the museum's job as well to disentangle these kinds of heritage packages, cultural zones, and separation of all of that. And I think the museums are just beginning to think along those lines, which is a great sign of really moving in a new direction.
Yeah.
But what is is there a perfect solution? I'm sure there isn't, and none of us have yet had the sort of insight into that. Carsten, you have a question, I think.
Yeah, well, I have a comment on this.
Yes.
We have the we have to think about the narratives we develop about our heritage, our monuments. And if we look into the World Heritage system, a favorite example of mine is Versailles, outside of Paris. And when you read how it is, let's say, justified that Versailles should be a World Heritage Site, it's all about how France has radiated its culture out in the rest of the world. It doesn't talk about Italian architecture. It doesn't talk about Persian garden architecture, which has impacted the way the whole layout has been made. And by excluding that dimension, you also compartmentalize art history and architecture and so on. And I think that's very unfortunate. And we have, as professionals, we have, I think, really an obligation to try to torpedo those monodimensional narratives and open up and talk about what is shared, what is common.
Yeah, no, that's a really great example, that Versailles is the source of it all, and that's why it should be on the heritage list. I agree with you completely. I wonder if anyone else wishes to comment on something, or should I go and ask or bring to you some of the questions so that we can take that one as an opportunity? Tallinn, do you have something? Yes, please, Herna.
I just wanted to say that art history, of course, is very fraught as a discipline. We have many skeletons in our past. We are often on the side of the powerful and the moneyed. But I think one of the things that I think we can contribute to these very difficult and very fraught discussions is that our professional tools as art historians, we know what evidence is, what historical evidence is. I mean, people, approaching art history in the spirit of professional integrity, and so I think it as fraught as the past is, as Carsten showed us so eloquently, we only have the remains of the past to try to understand what it was.
Yeah.
But the tools of art history can come into play in order to approach the past with a sense of integrity and ethics, and listen to the monuments, as Christina said, rather than begin with the narratives that we have now and impose them on the past. And it's not easy to do. It's not easy to do at all, because these narratives are very powerful, and they come with the power of states, of militaries, and other kinds of realities. But I think ultimately art history as a discipline has, and allied disciplines like archaeology and so on, have a very important role to play in introducing a calm and fact-based approach to very difficult situations.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and I think we often forget that ethical dimension of the work we do is a really important part of our contribution towards the really the changing of the world in which we live. And that's we are always at pains to explain why is art history so important, actually. Christina?
Can I just add one more thing about museums before we go on to, to the questions? And that is that the other thing that museums are doing, whether they know it or not, are preserving objects from these communities that have and monuments that have been destroyed. And that may not always be clear from what's in the galleries or what's on the website, but if you do some digging, you can find objects, Armenian inscribed objects from, for example, a place in the Nakhchivan Republic that has been erased, but that evidence exists, and it is in artifacts, and those artifacts are preserved in museums all over the world.
Yeah.
So I think there's hope there in finding traces of monuments and cultures that have been erased, and that work has largely yet to be done.
Yeah, yeah, it's a really important point, actually. So here I go, if I may. And I apologize in advance to the audience who has written. The sign of a good event is that there are very long comments and questions, so bear with me. And please accept my apologies if I happen to butcher your name. Katerina has written, "Dear speakers, thank you so much for your brilliant interventions. Could you name some significant collaborative strategies that have been implemented for the preservation of cultural heritage after World War II?" Actually, she meant to say, especially if these projects involved the active cooperation of ordinary citizens. And besides professionals in the field, scholars and organizations, what can we as citizens do in order to contribute to the preservation of cultural heritage?
What a wonderful question.
Absolutely.
That's a wonderful question. Thank you for your question. And I think and I'm sure Carsten has many important things to say about this. And the current thinking about, the whole critique of UNESCO and the international World Heritage idea maintains that one of the voices that has been less listened to or even marginalized are the voices of local communities, what in human rights language they call human rights defenders, frontline people. To give you an example, if you maybe remember in the difficult days of the Egyptian revolution in 2011, at one point there were some attempt to loot the Egyptian museum, where at that time Tutankhamen and objects from his tomb resided, and spontaneously people demonstrating in Tahrir Square formed a human chain to protect the museum. So that's an example, I think an example that I love about how normal people like you and me, can mobilize to protect cultural heritage that they feel is theirs, or even if they don't have a personal affinity to it, or they don't practice the ancient Egyptian religion, they recognize it as something that they care about deeply and want to protect. I think it's very important to listen to those local voices and to really understand what is the role that local communities can play, and what is the impact that they can have. And these are often the groups that are listened to the least. One of the examples that's often brought up as a very positive example of post-conflict work, cooperative work, is the bicommunal committee in Cyprus. But that is a committee that had a very difficult history. They started with a very small, very limited mandate, and eventually expanded to doing more dialogue. And also that happened a very long time after the heat of the conflict. I think when we're talking about the Caucasus now, the conflict is very raw, and many observers say still ongoing. And so it's very difficult to envisage something like that, but I really hope that that can happen.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the really wonderful question and the example you brought up. I can think of Iranian examples after the Iranian Revolution, where ordinary people protected Persepolis and wall paintings in Esfahan and so forth. And eventually all of this was embraced by the later generation of the Islamic Republic. And in other words, it's protection until later moment is always one of the solutions, and people, individuals have been very actively involved. Someone by the name of Rambo, I love your name. How do we rationalize the destruction of history today? Even today, the West destroyed Hussein's statue. I'm not saying it was wrong, but Hussein was part of history. Likewise, the Confederate statue is important history that we should never forget. Pretty complex issue. Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I'll jump in very quickly to say that I agree with Rambo that all parts of history of a society are important and need to be considered. I think in the case of the United States debates about Confederate statues, part of the discussion is, do they have a place in public space, in shared public space? Or are they best moved to, preserved and moved to places where they are not in front of a courthouse or marking a shared public space? Shared public space must reflect shared values of today, not the shared values of the past. So that's that's what I'd like to say.
Khalil.
And this is a question that many artists have addressed. It's so much about the interpretation of monuments, not only their location in the public space, but also the interpretation. So a long discussion was about Soviet monuments. What do you do with Lenin? What do you do with Stalin? True, they were of course part of history. So for example, Vodichko's answer is you shift their meaning, and Vodichko has addressed the Confederate monuments that through projections, for example, through artistic intervention that doesn't necessarily destroy the monument, but changes its meaning, give the public a moment to reflect on that particular, the problematic meaning of that monument in history, is the point. So it's not so much destroying the monuments so that you get rid of or just shove the history under a carpet. It's about actually using the monuments in order to come to terms and with that problematic history. That's precisely why the erasure of monuments is problematic, because it sweeps the problematic history under the carpet.
Yeah, that's yes, please, Carsten.
Another model, I agree totally with what Talin says, to recontextualize the monuments is a very good way of doing it. Another, if you do not know how to recontextualize them, if they're too toxic at the moment, you might just simply put them away, but keep them and then bring them out again when you know what to say about them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's also a really, I mean, it's not one size fits all, in other words, but to contextualize and think about the moment and how it can be addressed in order to preserve traces of history. In the end, the point is to preserve the traces of history. Herna, there is a question, Herna Can, there is a question for you, and I'm afraid I'm not able to read the Armenian title of the book that Rachel has pointed out. Can you see it? That in this book, Karapetyan discusses a lot of the World War II monuments in Nagorno-Karabagh and suggests they were destroyed because they were celebrating Armenian heroes of the Eastern Front. Do you have some comments on that? Or would you think this should be offline discussion?
That's fascinating, and I see that it's Rachel. Hi, Rachel. Thank you for your comment, and yes, I would love that book if you have it. I think what is being described here, it relates to our discussion just now, is how the monuments are perceived. In this case, these World War II monuments are being perceived as being celebrating Armenian contributions or losses during the Second World War, and not as the contributions of all Soviet peoples. So it's interesting. And I think Tallinn brings up a very important point about how monuments are framed, how they are understood, how they are contextualized, and how that can be shifted by artists or other thought leaders in a way that can spark creative conversations and difficult conversations, rather than present one version of what the monument says, but enable the monuments to speak and be read in very complex ways. I think that's a very hopeful and very positive way to approach them.
Yeah. Thank you. Boshra Musavi says, thank you for the very good webinar. My question is about the effect of the modern nations on the names of the places. I mean, the nations claim to own the places, and instead of using those places as a shared cultural heritage, they use it as a point to dispute on. For example, the name of the Persian Arabian Gulf is a point of dispute between Persians and Arabs. Goodness gracious, isn't that a point of dispute? What is the best solution about such situations? I would, if I may, I would say go back to history, to deep history, not to modern history and the disputations over such material, but going back to the historical context. But anybody else wants to to get into this particularly difficult situation?
I think I would just like to say that in many European countries in border zones like Alsace-Lorraine in France and the southern part of my country near the German border, there has been a double naming of streets and places, so that you can read in road signs, you can read a German name and a French name, or a Danish name and a German name. And I think that's one way of doing it, which makes a lot of sense.
You're not suggesting, Carsten, that we call it Persian Arabian Gulf?
No, probably not. I don't know what to do with that. I mean, that's really
exactly.
It's like the Indian Ocean and South China Sea and whatever. I mean, it's really difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question, Boshra.
I just have one thing to say. I don't have a solution, but what the problem is so pernicious because it means you can't even start a sentence with somebody who doesn't maybe share your views. You can't begin a sentence. And so that really, it's a huge problem. And so I appreciate the question.
Yeah, I agree. Totally. It's a non-starter. If that is not agreed upon, that we will deal with it somehow.
Yeah.
So Adis has a question. Thank you very much for the insightful presentations. In case a panelist may be familiar with post-conflict conservation in Southeast Europe, and in particular with respect to the establishment of the Commission of Preservation of National Monuments of Bosnia-Herzegovina, following the Dayton peace agreement in 1995, do you consider that an institution of that kind has contributed to peace building in a non-monocultural society? And what would perhaps be further means of conserving layered urban landscapes such as Sarajevo, but also more widely in Southeast Europe in the context of the 1990s Yugoslavian conflicts, particularly outside the often political decisions behind heritage conservation by both local and international communities? Another very complicated region and case. Any thoughts on that? Yeah, Tallinn?
I don't. I mean, I just want to. The the state of Azerbaijan has hired, has retained the Chapman Taylor architects, an London-based architectural firm, in order to redo the master plan of Shusha. So this is an example. I mean, this sort of the question, I just wanted to bring this issue up in terms of this question. What do you do with monocultural societies or societies with extremely diverse cultural heritage? But then you have a state with an agenda and who hires a corporate model firm whose only bottom line is profit. And so I'm just gonna add that to that question.
That's the end of that one, right?
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, what's the ethical role of the architect? And we have famous architects have a terrible history of their ethical role. I mean, Le Corbusier, one of them, I can name a lot of them, who because it's easier to work with one agenda and one source of funding.
Yeah, a state patronage is easier than a community patronage, so to speak, right? Absolutely.
I think Tallinn brings up a very important issue, which is the construction industry, urban planning. Big architectural firms, multinationals, corporations are also part of this very complex calculus. Yeah. In terms of Eastern Europe, I really appreciate the question, and I don't know, that's not my area of research, but I have found the work of Andrew Herscher, who deals with these issues, and the work of Emily Ginsberger Makash on the Bridge of Mostar and other places where she asks the question, can there be a conciliatory heritage? Their work is very, very powerful and has been a model for me. And the key thing there is that you have to continue to be vigilant. Just because the Dayton Accords had the provision for cultural heritage, which sounds so positive, just because something, a legislation or a principle is adopted, this is not the end. It's only the beginning or one stage. And so we as citizens or as cultural heritage activists or historians need to remain vigilant about how certain kinds of ideas are implemented, who is involved, who is not involved, who is included, who is not included. So it's a constantly ongoing process that can often be very fraught and very difficult.
Yes, Karsten.
Talking about the Mostar Bridge, I think that's a very good example, because here we had the international community descending upon the local community to say, now we're going to give you back your past. And now we're going to use this wonderful picture of a bridge connecting two sides of a divided city. But that was not what it was. I mean, there was two parts of the Muslim city that were split when the bridge was brought down. I think one opportunity which was really missed here was to bring in consideration about how can we bring an socioeconomic basis into this local community by developing also a sound tourism industry, the local tourism, people actually staying overnight there, and create jobs for people. What happened was that it was only the Kosovo Albanian part of society, which was the Bosniak community, which was involved in that, and the local Croats did not see that as their heritage at all. There were Croat engineering firms involved, building companies involved, but they came from the Republic of Croatia on the Dalmatian coast. And I mean, this just remained a divisive symbol of a past, which was not shared. And a missed opportunity for doing something with the economy for the entire local community. That was bad.
That's such an interesting point as well. I have a question again from Rachel. Recently, US and Turkey signed an agreement re-protecting cultural heritage. Many intellectuals and individuals were invested in cultural heritage in Turkey were overjoyed with this agreement, while individuals working in the cultural heritage of minority cultures in Turkey, those concerned with Armenian, Kurdish, Syriac cultural heritage, or for example, were devastated by the news. Arguments erupted online and the two approaches seem unreconcilable. Ultimately, states control the ways in which culture is preserved and processed. How can we work with states and individuals who don't seem to care about minority cultural heritage? I think you might have already spoken to some of these questions, if I may. Am I correct? May I move on to a question from Brigitte to Christina? You said that cultural heritage may be unknowingly preserved in museums across the world. I guess, okay, now she pressed it too rapid. Yeah. If the above is true, how does this impact on the move to return objects to their original homes? If there is a danger of deliberate destruction of a culture in its home country? Yeah, that's a really good question.
Wonderful question. And I'm not a lawyer, but I know that, so yeah, I talked about the fact that there are these objects that are preserved in collections across the world. And the questioner is asking, well, then what happens? I mean, should these objects go back? And I think that's where there are probably legal rules about recognized states versus unrecognized states in terms of patrimony, but that's maybe something that others can answer better than I can. But I would say the question is particularly relevant at this moment because in the conflict, surely a lot of objects are now not where they were. They're displaced and may be on the market. Who knows? There's been a lot of chatter, but this is a real issue. For the moment, you know, I would just say having an object like a vakas, like a liturgical vestment in a museum in Watertown that preserves evidence for a community in a place in the Nakhchivan Republic that is now destroyed is a great thing. But then another piece of this is, and Hegnar knows this very well, about the objects that were brought to this country because of the genocide. And so what do we do about those? And so this is a really complicated question with a range of implications, but I think it's particularly relevant at this moment. So Hegnar, if you have more to add there, jump in.
The question is a very good one and very, very complex and raises all kinds of dilemmas. One way to approach it is the notion of stewardship. Which is often invoked by museums who say that maybe this object was at one point looted in the past, but we have been very good stewards of the object. And let's pursue that for a moment. If the country of origin has been a poor steward of the cultural heritage of a group that is persecuted or unwanted, or the type of cultural heritage that is unknown or unloved or considered not important, or the forces of development and modernization are too strong, then there's an example where the country of origin has also been a poor custodian. But that said, I think we need to approach very carefully the notion that a Western museum that holds, say, objects from the objects that were removed during colonialism in Africa is necessarily always a perfect custodian of such objects. There are numerous examples of objects with dubious provenance that have been held in various Western museums. have not been kept with the best of standards, and fires can happen in all kinds of places. But this is a very, very difficult subject, and especially when you think about the cultural heritage of unwanted peoples that have been subjected to genocide, or who are indigenous people whose rights and whose culture is not taken seriously or understood, or groups that existed a long time ago and therefore are not connected to a contemporary group. And that raises some very difficult questions. What is the narrative? What is the story that a state wants to tell about itself? And what gets left out of that story? Which comes back to Carsten's point about how memory is made, official memory is made out of fragments of the past, and which fragments are unwanted and which fragments are included. It's very, very fraught. And I think, again, art history has a role to play here, because we have the tools that enable us to investigate a range of material culture in the past and in the present.
Yeah, really a very important point and a really important question. Arman Farahman Razavi says urban planners should study art history. We couldn't agree with you. Go, Arman. Bridget Blankley, could you please put, actually, that's a good point, put the two references about cultural heritage in the chat, Hegnar. You made references that would be useful to put.
Yeah, I did that.
Oh yeah, okay, I see Andrew Hersher and Emily.
Thank you for your interest.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And then I think there is a question or point. The head of Anahita, aka Satala Aphrodite in British Museum, is a very good example of such stewardship. In other words, what you were saying is how objects of great cultural heritage value have been mistreated, as well as being, stewardship that we can celebrate, of course. But who is to determine that is not necessarily just the job of museum professionals, it seems, in the West in particular. So I have a final moment. We are past our allotted time, and I just wanted to see if anyone wishes to add another thought before we say goodbye to everyone.
Just one consideration here. I mean, when we are talking about the international community and the international organizations and their obligations, we are first and foremost thinking of UNESCO. And we have to, let's say, keep in mind that UNESCO is set up by United Nations, which are nation states.
Right.
They do not necessarily represent all the minorities that we want to take care of, or whose heritage we want to expose. So there's a logical complication here in the setup of the international or the global bodies who are supposed to do that, because they get their mandate from the nation states, and they're not necessarily keen on having international organizations meddling into what they consider their past, their heritage.
Yep.
Can I just add one thing to that? And that is that's why what the problem Carsten raises is why sometimes the smaller NGOs are actually more agile and able to work in ways that bodies like UNESCO can't. And Carsten and I have seen that at work with the World Monuments Fund.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for a wonderful discussion. We had friends here with us from across the globe, including Christina, you'll be happy to know, some of our fellow travelers from the Caucasus.
I saw that. Yeah.
And I want to thank you for wonderful presentations, for openness in the discussions about what is truly a difficult subject, but also for pushing for us to both work across these different fields, but also how important it is to deploy the tools of art history to really make interventions here. I'm grateful to all of you, to the audience who stayed with us and actively engaged in the discussions, and to my Research Forum colleagues, and especially Rose, who've stayed beyond our time, and want to say good night and good day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.